Creo que la opción de quedarse callados no es una opción.
We need a political desire, and I'm quite disconcerted by the fact that it seems that it's the right extreme that have utopian discourse.
Because you can't have a democracy without informed citizens, and that's why education has to be at the center of any discourse about democracy.
Podríamos decir que solo el 1% controla el futuro del desarrollo tecnológico y tiene la capacidad de desarrollar la siguiente generación de tecnologías.
I don't believe that the social relations of capitalism can survive the complete rollout of automation, AI, and just the digital network potential that we have already discovered.
If the state oppresses men and women, the state and the street and the home together oppress women.
Authoritarian governments suppress writers because they want to suppress the capacity of people to imagine different futures.
The thing with fiction, with poetry, with philosophy, with political essays is it's more than information. It's giving us a way of thinking about the world.
Creo que la opción de quedarse callados no es una opción.
We need a political desire, and I'm quite disconcerted by the fact that it seems that it's the right extreme that have utopian discourse.
Because you can't have a democracy without informed citizens, and that's why education has to be at the center of any discourse about democracy.
Podríamos decir que solo el 1% controla el futuro del desarrollo tecnológico y tiene la capacidad de desarrollar la siguiente generación de tecnologías.
I don't believe that the social relations of capitalism can survive the complete rollout of automation, AI, and just the digital network potential that we have already discovered.
If the state oppresses men and women, the state and the street and the home together oppress women.
Authoritarian governments suppress writers because they want to suppress the capacity of people to imagine different futures.
The thing with fiction, with poetry, with philosophy, with political essays is it's more than information. It's giving us a way of thinking about the world.
Creo que la opción de quedarse callados no es una opción.
We need a political desire, and I'm quite disconcerted by the fact that it seems that it's the right extreme that have utopian discourse.
Because you can't have a democracy without informed citizens, and that's why education has to be at the center of any discourse about democracy.
Podríamos decir que solo el 1% controla el futuro del desarrollo tecnológico y tiene la capacidad de desarrollar la siguiente generación de tecnologías.
I don't believe that the social relations of capitalism can survive the complete rollout of automation, AI, and just the digital network potential that we have already discovered.
If the state oppresses men and women, the state and the street and the home together oppress women.
Authoritarian governments suppress writers because they want to suppress the capacity of people to imagine different futures.
The thing with fiction, with poetry, with philosophy, with political essays is it's more than information. It's giving us a way of thinking about the world.
Creo que la opción de quedarse callados no es una opción.
We need a political desire, and I'm quite disconcerted by the fact that it seems that it's the right extreme that have utopian discourse.
Because you can't have a democracy without informed citizens, and that's why education has to be at the center of any discourse about democracy.
Podríamos decir que solo el 1% controla el futuro del desarrollo tecnológico y tiene la capacidad de desarrollar la siguiente generación de tecnologías.
I don't believe that the social relations of capitalism can survive the complete rollout of automation, AI, and just the digital network potential that we have already discovered.
If the state oppresses men and women, the state and the street and the home together oppress women.
Authoritarian governments suppress writers because they want to suppress the capacity of people to imagine different futures.
The thing with fiction, with poetry, with philosophy, with political essays is it's more than information. It's giving us a way of thinking about the world.
Creo que la opción de quedarse callados no es una opción.
We need a political desire, and I'm quite disconcerted by the fact that it seems that it's the right extreme that have utopian discourse.
Because you can't have a democracy without informed citizens, and that's why education has to be at the center of any discourse about democracy.
Podríamos decir que solo el 1% controla el futuro del desarrollo tecnológico y tiene la capacidad de desarrollar la siguiente generación de tecnologías.
I don't believe that the social relations of capitalism can survive the complete rollout of automation, AI, and just the digital network potential that we have already discovered.
If the state oppresses men and women, the state and the street and the home together oppress women.
Authoritarian governments suppress writers because they want to suppress the capacity of people to imagine different futures.
The thing with fiction, with poetry, with philosophy, with political essays is it's more than information. It's giving us a way of thinking about the world.
Bona tarda a tothom. Crec que us he de felicitar per ser aquí, perquè això ha sigut una cosa tremenda. El tema de les entrades, voldria saludar també la gent que seguirà la conversa amb streaming. Moltes gràcies per ser-hi. Welcome, Maggie.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Farem una conversa. Al final hi haurà alguna estona per preguntes. No molt llarga, però sí que si voleu anar pensant alguna cosa, obrirem alguns minuts. Us he d'explicar, la Maggie al final signarà llibres. El que passa és que té un dolor, diguem-ne, que li impedeix signar tots els llibres de tots els que sou aquí i només en podrà signar 50. Els que esteu asseguts d'aquest costat us ha tocat una mica la loteria, perquè la cua començarà aquí. Si 10 minuts abans d'acabar començo a veure moviments, ho entendré, no passa res. Ella signarà, estarà aquí a dalt de l'escenari i la resta, doncs això, fins a 50. Així que no sé si dir bona sort, però vaja. Conversarem amb la Maggie, la idea és parlar una mica de tot, de la seva obra, perquè em sembla que ens interessa tot. Sí que volia començar parlant de la seva última novel·la, El retrat de matrimoni, publicat per l'altra en traducció de Marc Rubio Rodón, i en castellà El retrato de casada, la traducció és de la Concha Cardeñoso a Libros del asteroide. Si se m'aguanta el llibre... Més o menys. Thank you. So, if it's okay with you, I would like to start talking about the marriage portrait. And I wanted to know where did the idea for the book came, and what does it has to do with Robert Browning?
Yeah, well, I first had the idea. I mean, I suppose I should say that most ideas for novels, for me anyway, tend to have quite a long period of gestation. Sometimes it can take years, you know, sometimes, yeah. But this one is the exception to the rule. When I finished writing Hamnet, I couldn't decide what to write next. And so I was doing what I sometimes do, which is to be writing 2 books at once. I have 2 desks in my office, and I was writing one book on one desk and one book on the other. Yeah, just kind of just seeing which one would catch light, in a sense, which one would kind of pull ahead. But actually what happened was that I was rereading a poem that's taught quite widely in the UK. People usually tend to read it at school or at university or both. And it's called My Last Duchess, and it's by Robert Browning. It's a really fantastic poem, and it features a duke who is talking to a visitor, and he pulls back a curtain to show him a portrait of his previous wife. And he's saying, "This was my duchess, she was so beautiful. Oh, and by the way, I killed her." He's also talking to the representative of the woman he hopes to marry next, which I always think is quite an extraordinary thing to confess in that situation. Anyway, so I was just rereading it, and I was just wondering to myself whether or not it was based on real people and real events. And so I looked it up, and within a few minutes I had her name, Lucrezia de Medici, and the awful fact that she'd been 16 when she died. And then this portrait started downloading very slowly on my really old and rubbish mobile. And as soon as I saw it, I just knew that I would write a book about her, because she looks very unlike most Renaissance portraits, which I think are usually quite expressionless and blank. Their faces look quite enigmatic. Lucrezia, by contrast, looks very nervous. She looks worried. She looks, I mean, crucially for me, she looks as if she has something she wants to say. So it was really weird, because I knew straight away that I was looking at the subject of my next book. So I went home, and a bit like a toddler having a tantrum, I swept everything off my 2 desks. And I thought, no, I'm not going to do those, I'm going to do this instead.
Wow. And how do you start? I mean, you say this is going to be the subject of my next novel, and then what?
Well, actually, I did think, as I was starting to write about this, I worked out that Lucrezia had been born about 30 years before Hamnet did, and Hamnet was the subject of my previous novel. So I thought for a while, I've done loads of research about the 16th century, so I can probably get away with not doing much homework for this one. But I was very wrong, because the life of an 11-year-old boy in rural England in the 16th century is worlds away from the life of a 16-year-old principessa in a Renaissance palace. So actually it was all completely useless, that everything I'd learnt for Hamnet. So I had to pretend I didn't know it and start all over again. But actually I love doing things like that. I was always called a SWAT at school, which is what people are called nerds these days. So I'm still that. I confess openly.
So this book needed to start with some research?
Yes. I mean, I didn't really know much about art history and the Renaissance. I mean, I loved it, and I used to live near Florence, so I've been around the Uffizi Gallery, and of course we all love it, don't we? But I didn't know much about it, really. But that always quite excites me. I love learning things. So I did start researching it, and obviously her surname, Medici, is so famous. So she was born into incredible wealth and privilege, but at the same time, she, despite being part of such a famous dynasty, she seems to have not left much of a mark on the world. Her life, although it was very short, there's not really much known about her at all. But of course, there's a lot known about her family and her circumstance. So, and also, this was in 2020 and 2021. So there was no travelling. There wasn't doing nothing. I was like everybody else. I was stuck at home, homeschooling 3 children and getting through the pandemic, as we all were. So, yeah. So actually, armchair travelling to Renaissance Florence and Ferrara was actually really good. It really saved me, actually, because it means if I could spend an hour or a couple of hours a day in Italy, then I mentally anyway, I could just about cope with the rest.
And do you think the narrative of the book has something to do with the fact that you wrote it while you were on lockdown?
Yes, I'm sure. I don't think it's a coincidence that during 2020 and 2021 I was writing a book about a girl who has no choice in life and has one destiny. And also, actually, Lucrezia and her siblings were essentially in lockdown all their lives. Her father was Cosimo de' Medici, who was the Grand Duke of Tuscany, who was the ruler of Tuscany, and her mother was Eleanor di Toledo. And there were so many assassination attempts made on Cosimo's life that he never used to leave the palazzo without wearing chainmail underneath his clothing. So it was like a kind of early stab vest. And actually, I did read about one assassination attempt which I thought was so, inspired is the wrong word. It was very daring, I think, is the right. That makes me sound like a psychopath. But Cosimo used to swim every day in the Arno River. That was he was very keen on exercise, Cosimo. And he used to dive in at one particular point every single day. And one day he went down to the river and was about to dive in. I assume he'd removed his chainmail at this point. So he'd taken off his chainmail and was about to dive in, and one of his bodyguards, because he never went anywhere without at least 2 Swiss bodyguards, one of the bodyguards noticed that in the mud on the riverbed, somebody had planted lots and lots of swords facing upwards. So so if he dived in, he would have been multiply eviscerated. So that's the kind of danger they were in, because of course, this is Italy before Italy existed, in a sense, when it was made up of a jigsaw of lots of different city-states. And it was a kind of a halfway point between the Roman Empire and modern Italy that we know today. And some of these city-states were amicable and had good relationships, but a lot didn't. So if you were a ruler of, say Tuscany or Ferrara, you had to be always aware that there were enemies watching you. So her parents never really let Lucrezia and her siblings out. It was too dangerous because they were the heirs to the duchy, and they were so worried about assassination or kidnap. So the children were kept inside, and if they wanted exercise, they walked about the battlements. So essentially they lived in a couple of rooms in their palace.
Mm-hmm. I was curious about what do you decide to explain about Lucrezia? You discover her, you see the portrait, you have the impression that she wants to say something, that she's not fine. How do you decide what story you give her?
Well, her life was so short, so
yeah,
in a sense, it wasn't difficult to kind of think, well, which years shall I focus on? I think the main issue for me was whether or not he killed her. Her husband killed her, and it's not known whether it's a bit ambiguous whether or not she was murdered. There are some historians who think that she died of natural causes. There was an autopsy at the time from Alfonso's court of her body, which said that she had died of what they call putrid fever, which is probably pulmonary tuberculosis. But there were rumours at the time that he had poisoned her. And certainly there are 2 very interesting details for me historically, is that when Cosimo heard she had died, he dispatched the court physician from Florence to go and give her an autopsy because he wanted to know why she'd died. And by the time his physician arrived, Lucrezia was already buried. And also, after Lucrezia had died, it's documentary evidence that Alfonso stationed a spy in the Florentine court. So, I don't know, that begs the question, why, doesn't it? Why was he so worried? Was he worried about reprisals? Was he guilty, in fact? So, but, it isn't proved. So that, to me, was a very interesting ambiguity. And certainly Robert Browning in his poem definitely lands on the interpretation that he had poisoned her. But I thought at the beginning, when I started out, I thought, well, I should be fair to Alfonso. I shouldn't condemn an innocent man. But one of the things I discovered about him, which was documented, and he was very proud of this incident, was that when he discovered his sister was having a love affair with the head of the guards at their castello, he condemned the man to be strangled to death in public, and he forced his sister to watch. And I have a really strong memory of reading that in a history book and closing the cover of the book and thinking, right, Alfonso, I'm coming for you. Because that's the act of a really twisted, sadistic mind. It's so unnecessary. And I think he felt that it sent a message to his enemies that he wouldn't ever tolerate any insult or dignity to his family. But actually, what a terrible thing to do to your sister and another human being. And I thought, well, if he's capable of that, he's more than capable of murdering his young wife.
Lucrezia, she dies really young. She's quite rebellious. And I wanted to ask you, how much could you give her, taking in consideration that we are in the 16th century? I mean, she has a really nice education, which doesn't happen so often at that time, and her father considers her, and she's curious, but it's still the 16th century, so I don't know, what could you do with her?
Well, I think really Lucrezia was not so much a victim of her time, she was more a victim of her class and the family she was born into. Because if you were the child of a Medici, if you were a boy, your path would be that you would be trained up and educated to be a ruler like your father or a soldier, or in one of the cases her brother became a cardinal. But if you were a daughter of the Medicis, you had only one option to you, and that would be that you would make a politically advantageous marriage for your parents or for your region, really. You were representing the house of the Medici and the region of Tuscany. So Cosimo, in marrying Lucrezia off to Alfonso, the Duke of Ferrara, was seeking an alliance between his region and that of Alfonso. He wanted there to be an amicable relationship. And he wanted the children of that union they would be half Medici and half Este. And in his turn, Alfonso, I think, was really probably quite happy with the dowry that he received for her, which was, as I read in the book, it was 200 gold scudi, and I had no idea what this meant. So I asked a historian, and she told me that it's the equivalent of $1.5 million US.
Whoa.
I know. So that was the kind of money that was being exchanged in return for having a young wife from a neighboring region.
When you tell us about her, you also tell us about her mother, Eleonora. I wanted to know how did you build the character who is someone who is really loved by her husband and who is in charge of everything when he's not here, which I don't think if that was so usual at the time.
So her mother Eleonora was Spanish, and she was Eleonora de Toledo, and she had an arranged marriage with Cosimo. They had met briefly when she was about 13, I think. But 4 years later, when it was time for Cosimo to marry, the Medici and the Florentine court kept suggesting various princesses from Germany or someone else from a region. And he kept saying, no, I want that young Spanish girl that I saw 4 years ago. He'd had his eye on her all this time. And they corresponded, and then they did eventually marry. And really unusually, I think, for that time and for their milieu, like you say, they really loved each other. They fell in love, and it was a love match, and they really respected each other. And I think even more unusually, they were faithful to each other, which I think at the time was extraordinary. And it's often remarked upon in quite a lot of court documents of how astonished everybody is. And she was really quite something. She was incredibly beautiful, and she produced 8 heirs. Her nickname in Florence was La Fecundissima. But she was also incredibly capable, and she could speak several languages, and I think she did extraordinary things. Like she had a whole kind of honey industry and a silk industry. I think single-handedly people say that she invented the silk industry of Tuscany, not only because she had her own silk farms, but also she was often seen in the most extraordinary silk dresses. If you ever have any doubt about how much Cosimo adored her, you just have to go to the Uffizi Gallery, where I don't know if this is correct, but I suspect she's probably the Renaissance woman who has been painted more than any other. Cosimo obviously just commissioned portrait after portrait after portrait after portrait of her in various dresses and in various poses. There's one in particular which always makes me laugh because there's an amazing picture when she looks extraordinarily lovely in this kind of salmon pink silk dress. And the most expensive colour to buy at this time was blue. So painters were very careful about how much blue they would use because you had to literally grind up a lump of lapis lazuli, and often painters only ever used it for the robe of the Virgin Mary. But if you were Cosimo de' Medici, you asked your artist, so you can see Eleonora, and behind her, unusually there's no landscape or anything, which you usually see, it's just loads and loads and loads of blue paint. So I just imagined him having this conversation, saying, I want my wife in loads of jewels, loads of silk, and then masses amount of lapis lazuli, just to show how rich I am, as well as having a really beautiful, sexy wife. So yeah, they adored each other, and he used to cede his rule to her when he was absent from court, which I think was absolutely scandalous at the time, because not only was she Spanish, she wasn't Tuscan, she was a woman, and I think it took the Florentines a long time to get used to that. But eventually they absolutely adored her, because together with Cosimo, the two of them were this amazing kind of super couple, and they restored the whole region's fortunes, as well as re-establishing the rule of the Medici.
At some point of the book, Lucrezia, who's gonna marry Alfonso, she realizes that she doesn't know what it means to get married. I wanted to ask you how it's been to have a character who is that young and who has that kind of questions and the short experience of life.
Well, I was trying to be as true to her experience as I could possibly be, and I was just thinking, she's 13 when she gets married to Alfonso, officially betrothed and married, but Eleonora said that she wouldn't allow her to begin their married life until she had reached maturity, which I think basically meant she started menstruating. Which, yes, she was still 15, but thank God, really. 15 is not much older than 13, but it's a little bit older, thank goodness. But I was just imagining what it must have been like for her, because she lived all her life, like I said, in this palazzo in Florence, and the only instance of marriage she'd ever seen would have been that of her parents, which, as I've said, was this very respectful, loving, adoring relationship. And I found it slightly heartbreaking to think this really young girl, she's 15, and let's call her a girl, not a woman, because she was a girl, went off to this other family. And by contrast, I think the Medici court in Florence was quite a party place. They had loads of gambling, they had loads of acrobats, they threw massive parties, people would come by, and lots of visitors, and I think it was quite a fun place to be. By contrast, the Ferrara court, by all accounts, was very somber and serious, and if you were lucky, occasionally a poet would recite a very long poem, and that was your party for you. Not that I've got anything against poetry. I love poetry. I would probably quite enjoy the Ferrara court. But I think it must have been a huge contrast, not only in the difference of the court, but also the marriage was clearly very, very different from what she might have expected, having grown up with her parents.
Mm-hmm. And the buildings here are so important also. That's what you said. There's a party when she lives in Florence. Mm-hmm. It changes so much, and it's something that has so much to do with architecture of the place where she lives.
Yeah, so she moves from the Palazzo Vecchio, which is in the center of Florence, to the Castello Estense in Ferrara. And I used to live near Florence, so I knew Florence quite well when I was writing the book, and I had been to the Palazzo Vecchio, but a long time before, and just as a tourist. It never had occurred to me that I would ever write a novel set there. But I'd never been to Ferrara, which did worry me, but of course, it being 2020, nobody was going anywhere. So I had to content myself with looking through books or peering at photographs online, and I walked around Ferrara on Google Maps a lot. Because that's all the choice we have. But so I had to wait until travel restrictions were lifted, which was at the end of 2021, before I could actually go there. And when I went, my jaw dropped when I saw the Castello Estense. I don't know if anyone here has ever been, but it's enormous, absolutely enormous, so much bigger than I had expected, and very imposing. And it has this enormous moat around it with these huge drawbridges. And it's very imposing. It's a castle right in the middle of this, actually quite a small city. And I was just imagining what it would be like being her, arriving there and thinking, okay, this is now my home. I have to make the best I can in this new court.
Did you have to change anything after visiting Ferrara and going back?
Well, I was worried actually, because usually if the world had been normal, I would have probably gone to Italy before I really started the book. But obviously the world was not normal, and I had to write the book, and then just to kind of double check all my research. So I was worried that I'd got some of it wrong, because I have a very strict rule that I would never write about anywhere I'd never been. So I was nervous when I went, but actually it wasn't so much a case of having got things wrong. It was more being there. I had all this extra detail that I could add. So one of the things, I have a really strong memory of standing in the doorway of one of the salons in the Castello, and as I was standing there looking around myself, I noticed that the reflection of the sun on the moat, several stories below, superimposed itself over the frescoes on the ceiling. And I thought, well, that's why I'm here, because you can't know that from photographs and Google Maps and books. You have to be standing here to appreciate a detail like that. But also, actually, what I hadn't really bargained for was how emotionally connected you become to a character, particularly someone, who's real. Because obviously when I started writing Hamnet, I went to Stratford-upon-Avon quite early, and I looked around, and I hadn't really embarked on a novel. But by the time I went to Florence and Ferrara, particularly Ferrara, where she had spent her last few weeks, and where she died and where she's buried, I felt really quite upset, actually, because at this point I'd lived with her for 2 years, and I found it really heartbreaking. And one of the things I did was I was always sure that I wanted to go and see her tomb, and I would take her flowers, because I always think that she's very overlooked, So I went to the monastery, and of course it was right at the end of the COVID, so everybody was very COVID aware, and I had to knock on the door, and this tiny nun answered the door, and I explained why I was there. I wanted to see the tomb of Lucrezia de Medici, and she let me come in, and there were other nuns there. They were all tiny, so I felt like a giantess. I don't know why. And I said again while I was there, and they kept saying to me, "Do you mean Lucrezia Borgia, who is a very well-known Renaissance woman? She appears in lots of paintings. She's actually Alfonso's grandmother." And I kept saying, no, in my very poor Italian, no, Lucrezia de Medici. We had this back and forth several times. Anyway, eventually they said, okay, it's here. And then as I was standing at her tomb with the flowers, they said to me, no one has ever come and asked to see the tomb of Lucrezia de Medici. And I was so sad that I cried. And honestly, these nuns were kind of, who is this person? Right, and they've been in lockdown for 2 years, and suddenly this kind of crazy giantess appears, crying. And also it was really hot, so my hair was looking particularly mental, and I could see that they kind of ushered me to the door as if to say, we better get her out of here.
You need to send them the novel.
Maybe I will now. They probably think I was even crazier.
No, but now readers who go to Ferrara this summer, they will go bring some flowers to her.
I hope so. I hope so.
Do that if you're going there in the summer. And did you look for the painting? Because there is one painting,
yes,
I think.
There's one painting which was painted in Florence just before she left for her married life when she was 15. And it's by Agnolo Bronzino, who actually was a court artist. Cosimo must have loved him because he painted the whole family. There is actually a copy of it as well by one of Bronzino's apprentices, and that's in America. But there's one painting of Lucrezia in Florence, and I was really upset about this as well, actually. I didn't cry this time. But in the Uffizi Gallery, there's a whole room dedicated to Cosimo and Eleonora and their whole family. And this is where you can see many portraits of Eleonora. And several of most of her siblings are there. And so I went searching for Lucrezia's portrait, and I couldn't find it in the Uffizi Gallery. And I kept looking, and I actually had 3 art historians in Florence trying to help me find this painting, and nobody could find it. And eventually someone said, I think it's actually over the river in the Palazzo Pitti. So I went to that gallery, and I had a printout of the portrait, and I was asking all the staff, saying, do you know where this is? I'm trying to find it. And most of them said, oh no, I've never seen it before. I don't know what it is. We don't have that portrait here. And anyway, I did find it in this very crowded distant room, and it's not much bigger than a book, and it's very low down on the wall, and partially obscured by a fire extinguisher.
Oh.
So that's sad, isn't it?
Yeah.
I really want her to be back over the river in the Uffizi, where she belongs.
Yeah, you could have cried again.
I didn't.
Yeah.
I thought about it, but I know. I held it in. It just seemed to me very emblematic of how history has treated her, really.
Mm-hmm. In the novel, you gave her a taste for painting. She likes painting a lot, which is something that already appeared in other of your novels, and I wanted to ask you about that, about the importance of painting. There's at some point in the book, there's someone looking at the painting, I think it is, and they say, "Wow, this is beauty," and it's so.
I mean, I should confess that there's no historical evidence at all that Lucrezia was a painter, so I did make that up completely. But I was thinking, I think it came from two places, really. I was thinking about what it would have been like to grow up in the Palazzo Vecchio. And Cosimo and Eleonora had, for example, on their walls, Botticelli's Birth of Venus. And it was just hanging in their dining room. And, and Botticelli's Primavera. In the garden, as an ornament, they had Michelangelo's David. And I don't mean a replica, I mean the actual Michelangelo's David. It was outside their door. I have a pot plant, but they had Michelangelo's David. And there isn't an inch of the ceilings and the walls in the Palazzo Vecchio that isn't covered with the most exquisite frescoes by Giorgio Vasari. So I was just imagining what it would be like to grow up in a place where this surrounded you every day. You saw Botticelli's Venus every day when you were eating your breakfast, perhaps. And also, you know, I was very interested in the detail that you mentioned, that Cosimo and Eleonora chose to educate their daughters alongside their sons, which is quite unusual for that time. So Lucrezia and her brothers had the best education that money could possibly buy in Renaissance Florence, which of course was no small thing in those days. So they would have spoken several languages, they would have played instruments, they would have been fluent in ancient Greek, and they also would have had painting and drawing lessons from the best court artists of Renaissance Italy, which again is no small thing. So I was imagining as well, I think, what it would have been like to go into a marriage with someone like Alfonso, and how she would have needed to shrink herself down into that expectation. So she'd been living in the Palazzo Vecchio, she'd had all this education, but yet then she was expected to be a decorative wife and produce lots and lots of babies. That was her purpose, really. So I think she would have needed some kind of outlet. So that's why I thought maybe she could be a painter.
You say that, you made that out. I wanted to ask you how it is to work, to write a novel and dealing with what really happened. I mean, how do you do that? When do you decide that you will follow what really happened? When do you decide that you're going to invent that? How does it work?
Well, actually, there's not a huge amount known about Lucrezia. You know, she is a bit of a blank slate. She's someone whose history has been written in water. Although she's obviously part of a very famous family and a dynasty, she herself is quite mysterious. And I think to a historian or a biographer, those kind of gaps in a story would be frustrating. But to a novelist, they're a bit of an opportunity. So, and I do think that if you are going to write fiction about a real person, you do have a very serious responsibility to get as much right as you possibly can. And so I think you have to find out as much as you can. And I also have a rule that if I ever found out something about her that didn't fit with my story, I would have to find a way to make it work. I couldn't just pretend I'd never read that book. Because I think you do have a, you know, because it's, even though, you know, my Lucrezia obviously is fictional, I've still used her appearance, I've used her siblings, I've used her parents, I've used her name. So it's important to be as true to her memory as possible, even though she's been dead for almost 500 years. So I sort of had a framework of the real facts, and that's all it was, really. There's not much known. And then the rest I just made up. I have to confess, I did make it up.
Yeah, but I was going to ask you about what you just said. I thought that it might be so frustrating to want to know much more than what really is.
Well, I think, as I said, I think if you're sticking to the truth, like a historian or a biographer, that would be frustrating. But actually, for a novelist, it just felt like an opportunity. I wanted to... Yeah. I think my whole purpose in writing the novel was wanting to pull back the curtain that appears in Robert Browning's poem, because in the poem, the Duke talks about how only he is allowed to pull the curtain back and forth. So I thought, Alfonso's had his turn for 500 years. I'm going to pull back that curtain and she's going to get to speak now.
Yeah, because your Lucrezia is quite different from the one that Browning describes.
Well, there were certain details. I didn't want to be too slavish with Robert Browning, because obviously he's got his own version as well. But there were a few details from the poem which I plucked out. So Robert Browning mentions the fact that she has a white mule that she loves, which makes an appearance in my novel. But of course, Robert Browning is looking at her through the Duke's eyes, and I don't think he necessarily knew her very well. The Duke in Browning talks about how she smiles all the time, and he thinks she's a bit vacuous. But actually, I think she was probably terrified of him and maybe trying to appease him. So that fed into my novel as well.
Mm-hmm. I think I heard you once say that everybody, the question that people ask you most always is that true? Did that really happen?
Well, it's not unreasonable, I think, if you are going to write about real people. Mm-hmm. And I think there are people who want to know, is this bit true, is that bit true? But it's hard to pick it out. Actually, by the end of it, once you've worked on it for so long and you've researched it for so long, it does become a version in your head. So what I say to people always is it's a fictional version of something that actually happened.
Mm. I'm sorry, because I'm gonna do that. Is it true about the tiger?
The tiger itself is fiction, but it is true that, he may have had a tiger, I don't know, but it is true that he had, Cosimo, Lucrezia's father, had a menagerie of exotic animals in the basement of the Palazzo Vecchio. That was one of the first details that I read about them as a family, and I was so struck by this. I thought, oh my God, what an extraordinary thing to do, to have your own private zoo in the bottom of your Renaissance palace. So I thought, obviously that has to go in the book. That's just too good to ignore. So actually, the scene where Lucrezia meets a tiger as a child, she's about 7 at the time, where she comes up and she sees a tiger for the very first time. That's the first bit of the novel I ever wrote. In a sense, that was me getting to know her, finding out who she was, in a way. Because actually, I spent a long time looking through lots and lots of books about Renaissance art, which wasn't exactly a hardship, looking for animals, because there are a lot of animals in Renaissance art, but particularly exotic animals, and I found loads of tigers. Cosimo loved lions. Sorry, I found lots of lions. Cosimo loved lions. There are lions all over the Palazzo Vecchio. I think he thought it was a good symbol for him. But I couldn't find any tigers anywhere. It was really odd, and I kept looking, and then I thought, well, perhaps they'd never seen one. Perhaps it just wasn't possible in those days. So I was trying to put myself inside the mind of a child who was seeing a tiger for the very first time but had absolutely no preconception of what it would look like. Because if we see a tiger, even though we've known since we were babies what the tiger looks like, it's still extraordinary, isn't it? Because they are exceptionally beautiful and terrifying animals. So that was where that came from. But the story about the 2 lions attacking a tiger is actually taken from a real story that happened in London. So Henry VIII also had his own private menagerie, and he kept it in the Tower of London. And there is a story that a cleaner left an interconnecting door open and 2 lions set upon a tiger. It's odd, but it seems to be if you were a ruler in the 16th century, having your own mini zoo was a kind of status symbol. It's a very odd one. I suppose it's a bit like having a Ferrari or a Rolex these days. It's just what you had to show off.
Okay. And you said that this was one of the first things that you wrote when you write a novel. Mm. You don't always start with the beginning?
No, beginnings are really hard.
Okay.
I wish I'd known at the start. I wish somebody had said to me when I was starting out as a novelist, you don't have to begin at the beginning. You can begin wherever you like. I think it's the part of the novel that I rewrite the most, actually. It tends to be, because you have to... I find anyway that, I'm not much of a planner, either in life or in fiction, as my family will tell you. I find I can only find out what it is I'm writing or what it is I want to say by actually doing it. So I usually set out with some kind of idea of what I want to write, but I don't mind if things veer off course. I quite welcome it. I welcome the moment where the material starts to disobey you. That always feels like the right moment. It feels like the book is assuming its own heartbeat. So actually, I think there have been times when I've struggled over the beginning and I've tried to get it right and you have to set out your characters, you've got to establish their relationships, you've got to, write your setting. I mean, it's crazy. Why would you do that first? You need to kind of write whatever you can in a novel, just get words down on paper, and then by the time you've reached the end, you'll worked out what it is you want to do, and so you can go back and fix the beginning.
Mm-hmm. And is it important to first have a structure? Because in this novel, you go forward and then backward, and I suppose you need to know how to do that, or it comes just like that?
Yeah, generally, I mean, it depends on the novel, actually. Every novel is different, really different in that way. It's a bit like when you have children. When you have your first baby, I find anyway that you have this enormous learning curve, and you have to learn all kinds of things, how to look after babies, how to keep them alive, how to stop them falling down the stairs, everything. And then I remember when I got pregnant with my second child, I thought, oh, it's okay, I know about babies. And then she was born, and I thought, oh my God, it's a completely different person. And I have to learn it all again in a different way. And novels are quite like that. Everyone is different, and everyone has its own joys and challenges. And also, I think it's important to keep changing it, to keep changing the process and changing the way you do it. And usually the story will tell you what it needs. You have to trust the narrative, you have to trust the story, and there's a kind of instinctive part, I think, of your brain that you need to leave quite a lot of decisions up to. I'd leave decisions about tense often up to the kind of instinctive part of my head, because there have been times when I will stop, say, at the end of the day in the middle of a scene, and when I go back to it, I might suddenly realize that I'm writing in a different tense. I might have started it in the present tense, and I keep slipping into the past tense. And I think it's always very important to listen to that instinct, because I think if you keep slipping into a certain tense, that's probably the right one.
So it seems like it's a challenge every time you start a new book?
Yeah, but it's a good challenge. Otherwise, I think if it wasn't a challenge, you'd end up writing the same book again and again, wouldn't you? And structure certainly is something that doesn't always come straight away. In fact, when I wrote the first, maybe a draft or two drafts of this book, I had started with her wedding. That was the opening of the book. You see, beginning's always tricky. And I kept reading those drafts and thinking, something doesn't feel right. It just felt wrong. It's a bit like that sensation of when your shoes are much too tight and you're trying to walk around and it's kind of painful, even if you really like them. And it just didn't feel, and I realized that I'd started the book in the wrong place. So essentially one of the biggest, the most important decisions you make, I think, when you're writing a novel is where in the kind of chronological flow of the book, if you imagine the flow of the novel to be like a river, at which point do you dive in? Do you dive in near the sea, near the estuary, or do you dive in near the source, or do you go in the middle? And that essentially is your most important decision. And I realized with my early draft that I hadn't gone in at the right place, that I needed to start near the sea, near the end, and then go back to the beginning.
And when do you know that the idea you've had isn't a good idea? I mean, here you saw it really clearly by what you said, but how does it happen?
I think you don't always know, actually.
Okay.
And I think you need, I don't know, for me anyway, I think the kind of, if I was drawing a graph of my creative process, if such thing were possible, I think you'd have this kind of surge of optimism when you think, I love this idea, this is going to be my best book ever, I'm loving this, I'm really enjoying it, and then it's always followed by a massive crash, where you think...
Always?
Always.
Okay.
I mean, many, many times over, where you just think, what am I doing with my life? It's totally pointless, I have to get another job, this is useless, no one is going to care about any of this or any of these people, and that's a massive fall. And then you might, a few weeks later, think, actually, maybe there's that one paragraph that isn't so bad, and then you go up again. But actually, you need both of those movements, in a sense, because Your optimism is when you get loads and loads of words down on paper, and you might write 30,000 words and cut 25,000 of them, but there's still, and then you need the kind of crash in order to edit yourself. So you have this big surge of optimism, and you write loads, and then when you have a big crash, you think, well, that's rubbish, and that's rubbish, and that's no good, and you've started it in the wrong place, and what are you doing? And then it kind of goes in a wave pattern, is what I'm saying, rather clumsily.
And when do you know what the book is about? I mean, if we talk about the marriage portrait, I can say that it's about a girl who suspects her husband wants to kill her. But I can also say it's a book about hope, it's a book about resilience. I mean, does it go together, or is there a moment when you set the tone for the book, or I don't like this word, but like the message, or what you really mean?
I think that comes along the way, actually. You don't... I have a quote up beside my desk by Pablo Picasso, and it says, "If you know exactly what you are going to do, what is the point of doing it?" And I really like that. I think I'm sure it applied to a lot of his work, but I think it applies to novels as well. So I think you can often set out and think, I'm writing a book about X, but actually the book often ends up being about Y or Z instead. And that's okay. I think that goes back to what I was saying about you have to leave it up to instinctive decisions. And in a sense, I think fiction is often a bit like water. It will find its own shape. Narrative will find its own shape. It will tell you what it needs. It would tell you what it needs.
You said at the beginning that you thought that as you had written Hamnet, you knew about the 16th century, so it was going to be easier. Not easy, but maybe a little easier. I wanted to ask you about that, about Hamnet, because this is a book that I think we all love a lot, and we didn't have the chance to talk to you when it was published. I just wanted to ask you, what made you write Hamnet? Because I think this is a book that took you 30 years to write. Is that?
I'm not quite sure.
I mean, no, well, yeah. Okay, I'm going to say it again. That you wanted to write for 30 years, and then when you did it, you didn't use 30 years to do it. But yeah, I'm sorry. I just asked the question it's such a mess, but I think you understood me.
I mean, to be honest,
sorry,
it makes me sound very precocious if I say at the age of 16 I thought I was writing a novel about Shakespeare. I did not, absolutely not. I think the story, what happened was that when I was 16 when I first heard about the existence of Hamnet. But I certainly had no pretensions to write a novel, and it would never have occurred to me. I mean, I might have wanted it to, but I wouldn't have done it. When I was at school, I was 16, and I studied the play Hamlet. And I really loved it. It really got under my skin in a way. I think it appeals to a certain type of adolescent, actually. One who's probably a little bit melancholy and wears too much black, lots of eyeliner. And that was absolutely me. So I really loved the play, and I had a very good English teacher, and he mentioned in passing one day that Shakespeare had a son who was called Hamnet, and he died at the age of 11, and Shakespeare had gone on several years later to write the play. And this really stuck in my mind. It was extraordinary to me that this had happened. And I have a really strong memory of looking at the cover of my school play, my school copy of Hamlet, and putting my finger over the L and taking it off again and thinking, well, it's the same name. What does that mean? I sort of thought about it a lot. You know, I studied literature at university, and there was no kind of addressing at all Shakespeare's life. It was not about biography. It was all about the texts and the plays and the theory. And then later in life, I mean, it's funny, I couldn't remember exactly when I had the idea, but I was looking back. I keep a notebook where I write down any ideas, either goes all the way from novels to titles or possible. It's just a bit of a messy notebook. And I was looking back in it recently, and I saw that in 2013, I had written a novel about Shakespeare's son, Hamnet, and the connection to Hamlet. And at some point, I'd gone back to it and drawn brackets around it, obviously thinking that's an interesting idea. So I must have had it around that time, but I do remember that something that stopped me, one of the main things that stopped me writing it, was that I had this really odd superstition about my own son. because I have a son and 2 daughters, as the Shakespeares did, and in different birth order. He's the eldest. But I knew that in order to write this novel, I was going to have to put myself inside the skin of a woman who is forced to sit at her son's bedside and watch him die. And I just couldn't do it before my own son was past the age of 11. Not that there was a big risk of him contracting the Black Death, but you never know. You can't be too careful.
Just in case.
Yeah, just in case. So my son actually he used to have a joke that he would never have, I wouldn't give him a 12th birthday party because I'd be too busy upstairs writing my novel. And I would like to say he did have a 12th birthday party. That was a terrible lie. But it took me, I wrote, I think I wrote 3 books instead of writing Hamnet. So by contrast, Hamnet had this incredibly long build-up for me, unlike this one, which kind of arrived in a flash. And I was put off because I was worried about my son, and I also had this kind of sense of vertigo. I mean, there's always a sense of vertigo, I think, whenever you start a book, because really, what right-minded person sits down and thinks, okay, I'm going to spend the next 3 or 4 years writing this one thing over and over and over again? You have to trick yourself into it. There are always many more reasons not to write a book than there are to write one. And also I had the enormous amount of vertigo because it was about Shakespeare, and even now, thinking about it, even though I've done it, it seems like a ridiculous idea. So I thought, who does that? Who writes a novel about Shakespeare? That's a stupid idea. I should never do it. So I kept buying more and more books about Shakespeare. I had what my husband called the Hamnet shelf in my study, and I would read them, and after a while I had a document where I'd started some of the book, and then every now and again I'd open it and I'd write a bit more, then I'd think, no, I can't do it. And I wrote another book instead. And then actually after I'd finished, I wrote a memoir called I Am. And after that, I kind of gave myself a talking to, and I remember saying to myself, you either have to write this book about Hamlet, or you've just got to forget about it and stop buying books about Shakespeare. You've got to either do it or forget it. You can't keep faffing around and circling around it. So I had a look at the document where I'd written some things, and actually I realized very quickly looking at it was about 25,000 words, and I'd started it in the wrong place. I'd got into the river at the wrong moment, and so I scrapped it all and I started again. And I thought it has to open with him, with the boy, because the book will have to be called Hamnet, and I want to put him center stage. And so I started with this idea of a boy coming down a flight of stairs. And it was strange. It was just, for some reason, I don't know why, it was the right time in my life, and it was the right point in the book, and it was just like a key turned in a lock, and then I was able to do it. That's a very long answer to your question, sorry.
No, but it's nice. You gave me a much better answer than the question was. Yeah, thank you for that. I think you said that you had to wait until your son was 12, and we insist, he did have a party.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah, and I think that a part of the book was written also outside the house, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah. So I wrote the first half of the book, and as I was getting to the midway point at which, and it's not a spoiler to say that Hamlet dies halfway through, and I was just slowing down because I thought I really didn't want to write that scene. I really, really didn't. And as I was approaching it, I'd think, actually, I probably just need to go back and look at chapter 2 again, or I should probably just rewrite chapter 3 or 4. And then I thought I have to do it, and I couldn't write the scene where he dies in the house where my children live. So actually I wrote it in a shed in the garden, and it's not a nice, stylish writing shed. It was a horrible kind of spidery potting shed that has actually blown down in a gale. It doesn't exist anymore. So I wrote it in there in about 20-minute bursts, the 2 scenes where he dies and then he's laid out for burial. Yeah, they were not pleasant to write. But I wanted it to be as accurate as I could possibly make it. I think I've always felt that his death has been, downplayed or overlooked. I've read very respected Shakespearean scholars writing sentences like, it was impossible to know whether or not Shakespeare grieved when Hamlet died. And I always thought, what are you talking Yeah, but he was 11. How could he not? You know, I mean, this is nonsense. You know, and always his death is always often in these books is wrapped up in lots of statistics about how common it was for children to die. I think you had a 50-50 chance in those days of making it to your 5th birthday. So I mean, it was very high. But at the same time, I refuse to believe that at any point in history, anywhere in the world, it's been anything less than catastrophic to lose a child. You know, and I've always wanted to shout at these biographers, and I have sometimes. You know, you only have to read the opening scenes of Hamlet to realise how much he was grieved. You know, there's such a link between the play and the death of the son. And also, I just find it really baffling that no one has really ever explored why the play and the boy have the same name. No one's ever really asked that question, which is extraordinary to me.
Mm. And you ask yourself also, I suppose, a lot of questions about Agnes, about Shakespeare's wife.
Yeah.
And you start calling her Agnes.
Yeah.
Which is important.
Yeah, that's right. Well, actually, when I conceived the book, when I thought I would write the book, I always thought it would be about fathers and sons and absence and presence, which, of course, Hamlet is about, partly. But what happened was that I became very distracted by how badly his mother has been treated by historians and scholars and people who write films, and not mentioning any names. And it's really baffling. You know, we only ever have been told one story about her, and that is that she was this ignorant, illiterate peasant woman. She was ugly. She lured him into marriage. You know, she lured this genius into marriage by getting pregnant, and he hated her, and he had to run away from London to get away from her. I mean, I read all that in very respected works of biography about Shakespeare, but there's no basis of it anywhere in anything that I could find. I don't know. It just seems to exist out there in the ether. It's an idea that's constantly recycled and repeated, and that's all we ever know about her, which is so odd. And the ugly thing, I don't know where that comes from, because there's one portrait of her, which is a pencil sketch that was done, I think, from an original a while after she died. And in it, she looks, she's got quite a narrow face and high cheekbones, quite serious expression. And actually, she looks very like the actress Saoirse Ronan, who I think we can all agree is quite far from ugly.
Yeah.
No matter what you think of her as an actress, she's very easy on the eye. So, yeah, I don't know where it comes from. It's nonsense. And I think the thing that surprised me most, I think, about her, you know, a bit like Lucrezia, actually, there's not an awful lot known about her, really. I mean, Shakespeare himself is quite a shadowy figure, you know, despite efforts of the world's best biographers, tireless efforts. There's quite a lot about him we don't know. You know, no one has ever been able to work out, for example, how this son of a glover in Stratford-upon-Avon moved to London to be, to the stage and to become the world's most amazing playwright. No one's can join those dots. And scholars refer to them as the lost years. But she, she's even more shadowy. We know so little about her. We don't even know when she was born, because she was born before parish records began. And we know when she got married, and we know when her children were born, and when they died, and when she died. And that's it. So where all the stuff about him hating her comes from is just, you know, horrible misogynistic speculation. But one of the documents I read when I was researching it is her father's will. So her father, Richard Hathaway, died a year before she married William. And in it, in the will, he leaves her a very generous dowry. And in it, he refers to her as my daughter Agnes. And I couldn't believe it. I thought, well, you know, have we been calling her by the wrong name for all this time? Because surely if anyone knows her real name, it's going to be her father. So it just seemed to me very symbolic of the way she's been so misunderstood.
Mm-hmm. You weren't sure to write a novel about Shakespeare. It was such a success, and I think it's been turned into a play by the Royal Shakespeare Company. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So about a year ago, I had a phone call one day, and it's my agent saying the Royal Shakespeare Company want to make a play about a play of Hamnet. And I thought, what? So we had this very long conversation. At the end of it, she said to me, so are you saying yes? And I said, well, of course. You don't really say no, do you, to the Royal Shakespeare Company? So, yeah, it's happened. And I was so shocked. I mean, it's amazing. And so I've read some of the drafts of the script, and I've been to some of the rehearsals. I haven't seen the whole thing yet. That's going to happen in about 2 weeks. So, yeah, it's terrifically exciting. It's amazing. And it was so fascinating to be in the rehearsal room. I've never been involved in theatre particularly. I've never seen, but just watching the way they work, and they put this whole thing together with, lighting and movement people and the actors, and it's extraordinary. But it seems so moving to me that, the reason why I wrote the book is because I always felt Hamnet wasn't given his significance, he wasn't given his due, and now he's going to be on stage in the town in which he was born and died, and that's very, very moving.
I think yesterday there was another announcement of good news for you concerning a novel and the TV series.
Yes, that's right. It's going to be This Must Be the Place, and on Amazon.
Well, congratulations.
Very exciting, yeah.
What can you tell us about the project?
I know nothing about
Nothing?
it.
Okay. Okay, so next question.
That's
Thank you.
That's all I can tell you. That it's going to be with Orlando Bloom. Yeah, and but I'm more than happy to hand over the script writing to somebody who knows what they're doing, because I wouldn't know how to do it. I can put together the structure of a novel, but I wouldn't be able to structure it for TV. So I'm just going to sit back and enjoy it, really.
Wow, great, congratulations.
Thank you.
When I was reading the novel, at the beginning, when Lucrezia realizes that maybe she's gonna die, I instantly went to I am, and I thought, this might be a brush. I'm sorry, because she won't be able to write it, but, and I thought of your memoir. You wrote it, but you didn't want to write it. I mean, it was never in your mind to write a memoir.
No, not at all. I never occurred to me that I would write a memoir, because I'm very wedded to fiction, and I really like making things up. In fact, my husband and I used to joke about it. He always says that I'm one of the most secretive people he's ever met. And sometimes we both work from home, and sometimes I'll be putting my coat on, and he'll say, "Where are you going?" And I'll say, "Just out." And actually, I'm just going to the post office. I'm not doing anything exciting like having an affair. But I just don't like telling him. So he just says, "Okay, bye." So he said, when I told him I was going to write this, he said, "What's going to be in it? There's going to be nothing in it. You're not going to tell anyone anything." But I think it goes back to what I was saying about the instinct. I think the best book you're always going to write is going to be the one you can't not write. It's the one that's calling your name the loudest. And so I actually thought I was going to write Hamnet after I finished This Must Be the Place. And that was one of the attempts I made, and then I put it back on the shelf again. Because what started happening is I was writing in the back of my notebooks, I was writing these longer pieces about all the times I'd nearly died. And eventually I had to listen to it. And I thought, oh my God, I'm writing a memoir. I was horrified. But, in a sense, I think one of the things I learned, I think you learn many things from every book. One of the things I learned from writing a memoir is that there's a kind of, the idea of the ownership of narrative, who owns a story if it's a true story? Is it me? Is it, we're having this conversation tonight, and who would be able to tell it, you or me, and how much of it do each of us own? And that's true in every situation. So that was an interesting idea for me, and I think coming up with the structure of it, which is non-chronological, it's arranged by body part rather than time. And that was very freeing, because actually if you are writing a memoir which isn't necessarily in chronological sequence, it's possible to not give the names of your siblings, say, or your children, because if you were writing it chronologically, you couldn't say, and then my sister one was born, and then my sister, readers would think, what on earth is she talking about? And reasonably so. And also you can control how much of a situation you want to talk about, and there are all sorts of things in the book that I haven't put in. There's 5 years missed or 10 years missed, and so you are in control of what you can say about yourself. So I think the structure of it was the key for me in that way.
I'm glad you told me about you being like a mysterious person. I love that because I find that in your novels, there's always like something, you don't know exactly what happens. At the end of the novel, sometimes you don't know what happens, even when you've finished. And this is like a Maggie O'Farrell ingredient for me.
Well, I think you often write the kind of books that you yourself like to read. And I find that if I get to the end of a novel and everything is explained to me and everything is sewn up very neatly, that even if I've enjoyed the book, it tends to not live for very long in my head. But I think sometimes if a novel... If a reader has a few questions at the end of a novel, it tends to exist. It has a longer lifespan inside your head because you think to yourself, well, what was that? And did they do this? And what happened after that? So I suppose I write the kind of book that I myself enjoy.
I was interested in talking to you about I am, because one of the things that you explain is that when you were a child, you were sick for almost 1 year, I think. You need to stay in bed.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you what it has to do with you becoming a writer, because I think it was important.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I got viral encephalitis when I was 8, so I spent about a year in bed. I was off school for almost 2 years. And the doctors said I wouldn't walk again, and I would never be able to hold a pen. I'd have to go to a school, for a specially adapted school. So I've been incredibly lucky because, as you saw me walk on the stage, so I'm able to do that, mostly thanks to amazing physiotherapists. But yeah, I mean, I think an experience like that will always change you. And it's actually strange, when I was doing promotion for my memoir, one of the questions that a journalist asked me totally floored me, and no one had ever asked me this, and I'd never thought about it. And he said, if you could take that away from your life, if you could make it not happen, would you? Wow. And I thought, wow, I was totally speechless, which is unusual for me. And I thought, and I said, no, I wouldn't, because it's part of who I am, and it's made me who I am. But I think the key thing it did for me, apart from many things, is that it made me into a reader. And I always say that I used to teach creative writing a long time ago. And I always used to say this to my students all the time, that to be a writer, you first have to be a reader. And it has to happen all the way along, And that's all I did, really, when I was ill. When I was too sick to hold a book, I used to listen to books on tape. This was back in the days when we had tapes. And then after that, I spent so long in bed, and that's all. I just read, and I would read from one end of my bookshelf to the other end, and then when I did that, I just started again, and I read them all again. So I must have read things like the Moomins about 6 or 7 times, and I used to know them off by heart. And weirdly, when I read them to my children, I realised that I still knew them off by heart. And I would turn the page, and I'd think, oh, I know exactly what comes next. And I remember, I think there's something very important about rereading. I was talking to a friend of mine recently, and she was telling me that her 10-year-old son had one book on his bedside table and he read it over and over again. And she said, I don't understand why he does it. She said, I think I'm going to take it away from him. And I said, don't take it away. Because whatever it is in that book, he needs it, and he needs to hear it again, and he needs that repetition. And I find, even now, I reread books again and again. And, often I read a book for the first time and I feel as though I'm reading it as a reader. And if I really love it, or there's something about it that intrigues me, I'll read it again as a writer. And I will sit with it with a notebook and try to work out how the writer is doing what they're doing. It's a bit like an engineer taking apart an engine and seeing how it works. And I will do that with novels that I admire.
Mm-hmm. Let's have some questions from the audience.
Sure.
If it's okay with you. I'm going to give you
some?
Just in case they don't speak English.
Yeah, fair enough.
I will give you that.
My Catalan is very limited. Limited to 0.
Tenim 10 minuts, no gaire més per preguntes, però si... Veig que la cua ja comença. Okay. This is my fault. I said I would understand if they would move to have your signature.
Oh, wow.
Entre la gent que s'ha quedat asseguda, no sé si algú té alguna pregunta a fer-li a la Maggie. Aquí hi ha una pregunta. Em sembla que tenim un micròfon. Tenim un micròfon?
Oh.
No. Et sap greu posar-te a dreta, sisplau, per fer la pregunta? Sí que tenim micròfon, perdó. Mira, ara arriba.
Thank you. And from your last sentence, you talk about the novels that you admire. Could you tell it or not? If someone that you admire?
Oh, so many. I know that there's one, actually it's a trilogy of books that I have recently. I have a special notebook in which I will write down analyses or diagrams of books that I love. And the one I did most recently is by an English writer who's in her 80s now. She's called Jane Gardam. And the book is called The Old Filth Trilogy. And it's absolutely incredible. And it's one of those books that has an incredibly deceptively simple structure, but it's very, very complicated with about 3 or 4 different time frames. And it's about young children who were born in India, Malaysia, in colonial times, and how being the child of colonialists affected them. It's extraordinary. I don't know if it's translated into Spanish. I hope it is, because it is. Oh, good. My editor's nodding. Yeah, it's fantastic, but 3 books. It's funny, I read them a few years ago, and then in lockdown, I don't know why, I had this kind of urge to read series of books. I think I wanted to lose myself in this kind of long form. So I read them 3 or 4 times during lockdown. They're just brilliant, brilliant, very inventive novels.
Aquí hi ha una altra pregunta. Aquí davant, si vol... Bueno, n'hi ha una aquí, no sé si n'hi ha una altra més lluny.
Hello? Okay. So, Maggie, first of all, thank you so much. I think we all enjoyed a lot listening to you, so thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
And I'd like to know, if your Lucrezia would live nowadays, what kind of woman do you think she would be? And if you could ask her only one question, what would you ask? What would you like to ask to her?
Oh, gosh. Well, I hope if she lived these days, she would be incredibly happy, and if she wanted to be single, she'd be single, and maybe working as a conceptual artist in Florence somewhere. And I think, I don't know, one of the questions I'd like to ask her, I mean, I think I'd like to tell her, when you're on your way to Ferrara, just jump off the horse and run for it. Run for it, run for the hills. Don't get into that castello with him.
Hi ha una pregunta allà darrere.
Hello. I just wanted to ask you about the book's ending, because I had to read it twice. Because
Can I just stop you there and be very careful what you say?
No spoilers,
because there might not be people who have read it yet.
Yeah.
No. What is your intention to be interpreted?
Oh.
Okay, I tell you what I can say about the ending is that we have to be very careful, because someone actually, one of the very early events I did in London, someone got up and said something about the ending, and honestly, I thought the rest of the audience were going to kill her. We had to kind of say, everybody sit down, because they were so angry. So I'm just saying, I don't want anyone to kill you. Okay. Or to have any violence towards you. So what I will say is that I always wanted the ending to be as it is, but I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to pull it off. So when I handed it in, I was a bit worried that my editor would come back and say, I'm sorry, what? But she didn't, so it's lucky. But that's all we can say. But thank you for your half a question.
And then just a very short comment that now there's still an exhibition at the PT on Eleonora's life.
Oh,
really worth it.
I didn't know that. Oh, excited! I'm going to go to it. Thank you.
Is there any other question? Yeah, right here, please. Aquí hi ha una pregunta. Ah, i allà també, perdó. Primer n'hi ha una allà al fons, no l'havia vist.
No. To ask, how difficult is it for you, like when you're writing about a 15-year-old girl in the 16th century, how difficult is it for you to get rid of the present? Like in some scenes, this is not a spoiler, but as we know, she's getting married to Alfonso to have children. So like the first time that she's in bed with Alfonso, like how hard is it for you or not? So is it easy for you to get rid of the present way of seeing this?
Yeah, I mean, those scenes were not easy to write, certainly, and it wasn't a prospect I relished at all. But I think what I realised I had to do was to, in order to be respectful and to honour the experiences of what girls like Lucrezia went through, I had to be as honest as I could about it. And, you know, I didn't relish the prospect of writing a wedding night between a 15-year-old girl and a 27 man. And I tried to think about it in terms of, you know, maybe 15 then is different from 15 now, you know, because given that life expectancy was 42. But I think I came down on the fact that, no, it's gross. She's 15. It is gross, and in any context, it's gross. So no, but I felt I needed to not shy away from it and not kind of do a sort of, and then the next morning, you know, because that wasn't being true to the narrative. If I was going to write this book, I had to write all of it.
Hi havia una pregunta aquí davant i tindrem temps per una més. No sé si... Ui, per dues més. Una aquí i una allà. I ja està, ho sento.
Excuse me, my English is not very good. I'm going to ask you in Catalan. Is it possible?
Yeah, your English is a lot better than my Catalan. Yeah.
Et vull preguntar si hi ha algun element comú o hi ha similituds entre els personatges de la Esme Lennox i la Lucrezia i les seves respectives mares. No sé, he trobat elements comuns, et volia preguntar si havies pensat o no.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think there is a kind of dialogue, in a sense, between Lucrezia and Esme, certainly. They are actually, weirdly, they're the same age for lots of the novel. So, yeah, I think there is. And I think, I mean, I wouldn't want to be too harsh on Eleonora, Lucrezia's mother. I mean, I think she, given that the context in which they live, you know, she was very intelligent. She was incredibly busy. Not only did she have 8 children, she was, for a lot of the time, running a whole Renaissance region, which is pretty impressive. So yeah, and I think she was actually quite involved in her children's, a lot more involved in her children's lives than a lot of mothers in a similar position. She gave them an awful lot. She was very religious. She gave them a lot of religious instruction. She was very attentive at their needs and clothing and education. So I think she did what she could. But you know, in that class, if you were a duchess in Renaissance Italy, you didn't nurse your own child. It went to a wet nurse. You were expected to be present at state events. She had to run the region, and so the children were brought up by wet nurses and nannies. But yes, she's a bit unsympathetic, I think, when Lucrezia has to go through, you know, to marry this man. But in a sense, that was part of the system in which they all lived. You know, if she hadn't married Lucrezia off, or she hadn't agreed to it, I don't know what would have happened to Lucrezia. I don't know. So in a way, yeah, I would think Esme Lennox's mother is guilty of a lot more than Eleonora, to be honest, if we're going to compare the two.
We had 2 more questions. One was there and the other one was here. So,
thank you, May, for being in Barcelona. Thank you very much. And thank you for being a contemporary writer of ours, because we can meet you, and this is a lucky. Just a question: what are you working on? And if it's the case, it is possible to write another book of a woman, because I noticed that Hamnet and the last one, there are two women that you take of the history, which it has been very bad for them, and you are reivindicating the women. Are you working on that for another book?
I am writing another book, but I'm afraid one of my other superstitions, alongside my son potentially catching the plague, is that I hate talking about books that I haven't finished yet, particularly the first draft, because the idea feels so fragile at that point. You don't want to let any air in. I don't even tell my husband what it is. He says he can sometimes guess by the books that arrive in the house, but that's as far as it goes. So I can't really do. I can tell you that it is historical, and at the moment it's about a father and son, but it's not Hamnet again, I should say. Something different.
And the last one was right here.
Hello, Maggie.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Good. Very well. Well, the thing is that in America, the Hamnet was titled Hamnet and Judith, wasn't it?
In Canada, yeah.
Oh, in Canada it was.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, well, while I know what Hamnet means for you and also for me, and while I was translating it into Spanish, I thought very often that it should be titled Agnes. Because she's so strong a person.
I didn't realise it's Concha, isn't it?
Yeah.
My Spanish translator. Everybody give her a round of applause. Yes, because it's funny. In fact, my Canadian editor and also I think my German editor wanted to rename it Agnes. I think they were worried about people mistaking it for some play. I don't know which one it was. But I was actually it may shock you to learn that I'm quite stubborn. And I said, no, you can't call it Agnes because it has to be Hamnet. I wanted the name to pull people up short. Apparently, someone told me that in Stratford-upon-Avon, where the play is about to open, they have a poster outside, and apparently an old man came into the theatre and said, I want you to know that there's a mistake in that poster. Which I love. I love the fact that happened. It's such a sweet thing to happen. And they said, we know it's not a mistake. Anyway, so I mean, it could have been, but I wanted there to be that kind of, I wanted people to look twice and think, what does that say? Does it say Hamlet or does it say something different? I wanted immediately for there to be a link between the play and also the name of the novel, to people to ask themselves why it's like Hamlet but not quite. And I think if I had called it Agnes, it wouldn't have given people that question. It wouldn't have. I mean, the name Hamnet makes you realise in a sense what it's about before you even open it, possibly. And I think Agnes wouldn't have done that. So I allowed my Canadian editor and my German editor to call it Hamnet and Judith. It was Hamnet und Judith in Germany. But actually, in Canada, when the paperback came out, they called it Hamnet again. So who knows? It's not up to me.
At what point of your writing you decide the title of a book?
Often it's right at the end. Yeah, it's a bit like that with when I had my children. I couldn't be one of those people who was pregnant and say this baby's going to be called Elizabeth, or I had to be able to see it, to look into its eyes. Yeah, so it's a bit the same with books. I need to, but I always knew this one would be called Hamnet, but this one, I couldn't decide on a title at all up until the point my publishers were about to publish the catalogue, and they were saying, you have to decide, we need to know, we can't just put Untitled by Maggie O'Farrell in the catalogue. So yeah, the titles are really hard, actually. They either come straight away, and have always been there, or it's a long wrestle with yourself about what it is you're trying to say.
Thank you so much, Maggie. It was great to having you here, and you have a long line. I think there are more than 50 people. Yeah, I don't know if you have the chance to have the book signed. Thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure.
And
Thank
come
you.
back soon with the next novel, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'm sorry because at some point I